Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, what is making the headlines right now? Well, what is making the headlines is the assertion that Russia is spending more on its military than all of Europe combined. All right, let's get to the truth of the matter. Now, I'm going to read to you the headlines of several articles that have come out. Russian defense spending overtakes Europe, study finds. Russian military spending increases outpaced all of Europe. Russian defense spending overtakes all of Europe combined. Russia's military spending surpasses Europe's as Putin ramps up war budget. Russia overtakes all of Europe defense spending in key metrics. And then finally, this is interesting. As U.S. refuses to defend Europe, Russia's military budget now bigger than all of Europe. All right, well, let's just get to the raw numbers. It's believed that going into 2025, Russia may spend approximately $140 billion on its military. Now, look, that is significant. It's quite a bit more than what Russia was spending prior to the ongoing war. But is it larger than what all of Europe is spending on its militaries? No, it's not. Absolute fact. The Germans and the United Kingdom combined spend as much as the Russian Federation. They both spend between $60 and $80 billion. Germany and the UK. Not to mention other nation states such as Poland, France, Spain, and then you have to look at the assistance that the United States also provides these Western European nation states. Now, what they're talking about, what they're trying to finesse, is claiming that this is based on PPP or the purchasing power parity that exists. The ability of a dollar or a means of credit or debt will go further in the Russian Federation than, say, in Berlin. That's what they're talking about, and it does hold merit to some extent. But if you look at and a lot of that is because of compensation, the paying of monies to individual soldiers. If you go into Europe, the United Kingdom, Germany, the members of these militaries make substantially more money than in countries in Eastern Europe, say China, or not Eastern Europe, Asia, China, the Russian Federation. Now, what has changed is Russia has really increased the compensation of a lot of its soldiers, right? So the average Russian soldier that is entering the armed forces is now making a fairly decent wage when compared to the average Russian wage. So that's in part of what is happening. And at the same time, obviously, Russia is in a state of war. That is what is happening. Now, would Russia be spending $140 billion on its military if NATO had not expanded into the Ukraine? Would Russia still be spending $140 billion if NATO had not expanded into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, the largest military base ever in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization history is now being built in Romania? What do you think that's designed to defend against the Bulgarians? Do you think that's what that base is being put there for? No, it's not. Of course not. It's being put in Romania, and Romania is now part of NATO to project power against the Russian Federation. Make no mistake, the only objective right now for NATO is to break up the Russian Federation. That's its goal. If you look at the status quo, what existed in terms of military capability prior to 2022 in the invasion of Ukraine, the quote-unquote special military operation by the Russians. Was there a military threat by the Russian Federation towards NATO or Western Europe? Remember, Ukraine is not part of NATO. It's irrelevant. In terms of NATO, in the creation of NATO, the Ukraine is irrelevant. It doesn't mean anything. Again, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was designed to defend Western Europe. And it has greatly expanded eastward, and at the same time, it has taken on new mission sets, new very aggressive mission sets. Go ask the Serbians, right? During the bombing campaign against Yugoslavia and Serbia, was Serbia a threat to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? Was there this capability by the Serbs to launch a military operation into Western Europe? No, absolutely not. But NATO used this immense military capacity to essentially attack a neighbor because it did not like what it was doing internally. Do you see how this works? Do you see how this is playing out? So if NATO does not like something that you are, as a nation state, and you are not part of NATO, that you are doing, then NATO has proven that it will use hard military power, not to mention soft military power, USAID, soft power, in attempts to change a nation state's government. In retrospect, let's look at here at the United States. If we were to come to the conclusion that, let's just say, billions upon billions of dollars were being used by, say, the Chinese or some other nation state to actively change the government inside of the United States, we would be a little perturbed, right? Of course. Now, again, going back of the relationship between the Russian Federation and Western Europe, i.e. the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, same thing. Same thing is happening. First, soft power was used in the Ukraine to try and change its government that at the time was sympathetic to the Russian Federation. which is completely reasonable given the past relationship that existed between Russia and the Ukraine. Again, most Ukrainians are Russians. And that's a fact. But again, the concept of this $140 billion military budget is cause and effect. That military budget would not exist, would not have gone up in the case of conflict. Prior to 2022, in terms of the Russian defense structure, it was not designed to launch a military invasion into Western Europe. If you look at the organizational chart of the Russian military, they had transformed into predominantly a brigade set type of organization. Their largest combat units were these combined arms combat brigades, and really the Russians operated with these battalion tactical groups. Okay, these battalion tactical groups and these brigade sets that the Russians were using up until 2022, and that obviously changed because the nature of the threats that were presented against Russia also changed. That Russian military that existed prior to 2022 was not designed. It was not a force construct that was going to invade Western Europe. Western Europe was never was never going to be attacked by the Russians. That capability did not exist for Russia. Now things are changing. Russia drew a red line in the Ukraine, and they said, no, NATO cannot expand. We've set back. We begrudgingly allowed Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania. Again, all of these countries that were at one point were part of the Warsaw Pact. Were part of that Soviet sphere of influence. Okay, the Russian version of NATO. But the Soviet Union collapsed. There was no longer a military threat. But NATO continued to expand, and that's why we're at where we're at today. Very unfortunate. And again, the misinformation, the news headlines that state that Russia now outpaces all of Europe in terms of military spending. It's not true. Again, you might be able to argue the purchasing power parity, the purchasing power, but dollar for dollar, ruble for ruble, the Russians are not spending more than all of Western Europe. But it's just simply not the case. And again, I think if we look at what is happening here in the United States, if we look at what is happening with USAID and its infiltration and its use not only against the American people, the manipulation of politics here in the United States, but that is also multiplied in terms of USAID, in terms of its operations against other nation states that do not embrace this Western version of democracy, which is neoliberalism. And a lot of folks here in the United States do not embrace that variation of democracy either. And again, the Russians are drawing the line and saying Ukraine is that red line. And unfortunately, we've kind of crossed that Rubicon. And what is war? War is just the extension of politics by other means. And thus, the Russians are using war, just like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization used war, hard power, against the Serbians. Just like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization used war and hard power against Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. And you could argue, I think there's a very good case for the argument that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is using hard power and or war against the Russian Federation. The problem is Russia is not Serbia. Russia is not Libya. So this soft power / hard power influence into the Ukraine, which eventually resulted in a civil war, Russian against Russian, spurred on by outside influence, i.e. the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, USAID, which caused the conflict we are looking at now. It's a fact. Now, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, at this point, the Russians, in all probability, see the current Ukrainian state that, again, gravitates towards an incredible threat, realistically. The Russians perceive the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as an incredible threat. And again, as I've talked about before, that threat is due to eastward NATO expansion. The only other option now for NATO to continue to expand is to break up the Russian Federation. And the Russians believe that is the goal of NATO right now. And they're not going to allow it. Thus, the war will continue. Now, right now, we are in the winter of the Iron Rain. Russia is using its air power, its long-range artillery systems. It's vastly improving and growing drone warfare capacity against the Ukrainians, against the forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the proxy forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And in all probability, special operations forces, intelligence-based forces of NATO are being used in the Ukraine as well. So at this point, we will probably continue to see the Russians use its air power, its long-range artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, cruise missiles, drones, to degrade and destroy the Ukrainian military. And in all probability, going into the summer, we anticipate a very enlarged Russian offensive. Yes, the Russian military continues to grow, and it's going to continue to grow. Why? Well, it's at war, and it perceives itself in grave danger from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And again, we cannot say that NATO is a purely defensive organization. Look, it won the Cold War. There was no longer a direct threat by Russia against Western Europe. That threat disappeared. And now fast forward, NATO has moved into all, not some, not most, all of the Eastern European nation states that were formerly part of Russia's version of NATO. And now, NATO is attempting to move into areas some see as part of the Russian Federation. Eastern Ukraine, Crimea. So again, as always, look, thanks for joining us today. Again, this is probably the smartest group of individuals who pay attention to YouTube, who watch content, and who are not uninformed urbanites. As always, have a good day.